to. If you haven't heard, perhaps you're living in a cave. This was the week of the Hunger Banquet on Thursday and Saturday night. For those of you who have not attended the Hunger Banquet, this is really a great opportunity to have an interactive experience, learning about hunger, and also contributing to what turns out to be a great development project for those students in the IES 220 class. So purchase your ticket now. They're available at the Wilkinson Center information desk. Martin Burt, who will be the keynote for the Hunger Banquet, is the founder and the CEO of Fundación Paraguaya. He will be speaking at both nights of the Hunger Banquet, but he'll also be providing a lecture on Friday at 3 o'clock in this room on careers and development, which for those of you who are thinking about careers and thinking about development will be, I think, a worthwhile visit. I also point out next week we will be hosting Keith J. Allred, who is a senior trial judge and presided over the first proceedings in Guantanamo Bay. He is with the U.S. Navy and has had a number of interesting legal positions. He will be talking about his reflections on that experience at Guantanamo Bay next Wednesday at noon. Again, that will continue on with our Wednesday at noon series. And I'd encourage you to take a look at our website for the proceedings, the video, or the MP3 files of almost all of our previous lectures. You can also look at the calendar or sign up for the RSS feed or follow us on Facebook or Twitter if you're interested in just staying abreast of what's going on at the center. Our website, as you know, is kennedy.byu.edu, and I encourage you to sign up and stay connected with us. We'd like to start with an opening prayer, as is our custom, and we've asked Alexis Lupton, who is an international relations major from Los Angeles, California, to offer that. Then I'd like to turn the time over to Professor Wade Jacoby, who's a professor of political science and director of BYU's Center for the Study of Europe, and he will introduce Mr. Bronk. Alexis?
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this day. We're grateful for the opportunity we have to come and listen to the lecture, and we're grateful for the preparation that has gone into it. We ask a special blessing that we can pay attention and learn what professors wanted us to learn, and we ask that we can have a good rest of the day and a good rest of the week, and we can try and do our best in our studies. And we pray for these things in my Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
As a faculty member, I often get asked by people who are thinking about majoring in poli-sci or international relations, and I'm sure this is probably true in French and economics. What can I do with this degree that I'm getting in the liberal arts? And my answer is usually some version of lots of things. I got to do lots of things before I took this job, some of which came directly out of my liberal arts degree. But in some way or another, I'm usually saying that the kinds of things you learn in a really good liberal arts undergraduate education are things you can take into a wide variety of professions later on and arguably enrich that profession by the knowledge you bring into it. Well, rarely is there such a good case in point as today's speaker, Richard Bronk, a good friend of mine from the London School of Economics and Political Science, who did his undergraduate degree at Oxford in classic literature and philosophy, and then went off to work for the Bank of England. Now that, so far, is not so different from what I think a lot of people do, and what many of you will do. Not necessarily the Bank of England, but it might be a think tank, it might be an NGO, it might be a business, it might be many, many things, teaching. But then he did something, I think, really remarkable. He worked for 20 years, not just the Bank of England, but in finance, in and around London, often working on the continent, in particular working with investment funds in European markets. And then about a decade ago, he started teaching at the London School of Economics. And he wrote one book, and then wrote another book. And the second book that I want to mention, and which will be the subject of his talk today, he really kind of went back to that undergraduate education, to philosophy and the classics and literature, particularly 19th century literature, and asked the question, what could the ideas from that earlier education do to enrich the kind of economic thinking that I've been around for the last 2 decades? And rather than keep those meditations as a private matter, like so many of us do, he wrote a really ambitious and incredibly interesting book, which is called The Romantic Economist. And I guess you have the slide right there, so I don't need to hold this up, but here it is. I've put a couple flyers in the back of the room. I think there's a discount on there if people are interested in buying a paperback copy of this. Came out from Cambridge University Press last year. It's a delight to read, fascinating on many levels. We've asked him today to take a little slice of it and to talk about understanding the economic crisis. And the title, as you can see, is Understanding the Economic Crisis, The Romantic Economist on Why Models Failed Us. I'm delighted to welcome to BYU Richard Bronk.
Thank you very much, Wade, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, the economic crisis that we've all been living through for the last couple of years has many special features. And among these, I think, is that it represents a crisis of credibility for the economics profession, quite as much as for Wall Street bankers and regulators. And what I want to do today in my talk is to look in a very unusual place for some answers to help unpack why it is that I think economists failed so spectacularly to provide good advice in the run-up to the economic crisis. So to this end, as Wade has mentioned, I'll apply insights provided by some of the Romantic poets and philosophers living in England and Germany around 2 centuries ago. And I will use their critique of narrow rationalism to touch on some use that critique of narrow rationalism to touch some new approaches to economic modelling, and then outlines what it could mean for economic policy and for government policy. Now, by way of opening summary, the essentially romantic explanations that I will offer you for why economic models failed come under 4 thematic headings. The first 2 are epistemological and relate to the kind of knowledge open to us in a multifaceted and dynamic and uncertain world, and to the role that models play in structuring our vision and influencing behaviour. The Romantics always insisted that there is no one right way of looking at the world. There is no uniquely valid perspective that captures all important aspects of reality. Rather, every time you use a model, metaphor, theory, or language, it structures the way you see the world in a particular way. And by structuring your vision, beliefs, and therefore behaviour, these same models or theories help construct social and economic reality. I will explain how this has 2 key implications for understanding what has gone wrong in this crisis. First, whenever economists and policymakers rely on what they believe to be the single best model, this can lead to a dangerous myopia, a tendency to miss aspects of what is going on. And secondly, if most banks and government agencies converge, as they did recently, on a particular set of economic or risk models, this leads to a homogeneity or sameness in behaviour and high correlations across markets that can themselves be dangerous when something goes wrong. Another set of themes here relates to the Romantic insistence that social and economic life is a dynamic and creative process akin more to a biological organism than to a predictable machine. And I will show how this perspective suggests that the kind of radical uncertainty Frank Knight famously distinguished from measurable risk may be much more prevalent than most economists assume. And finally, the Romantics were always clear that imagination, emotions, and moral sentiments matter as much as reason. And I will argue that here too the Romantics have lessons for economists, since economists systematically underestimate the role of innovation, animal spirits, and morality. In these ways, I hope to provide you with some important and little discussed explanations for the financial crisis, and then to draw some implications for how economists might improve their models and analysis, and how policymakers might adjust their own focus accordingly. But let me start by going back a bit, and to the question that I suspect many of you are already asking: why on earth would you want to put the romance back into economics? And I can perhaps best give you a preliminary answer by how I first became interested in the idea. As Wade said, before I joined the London School of Economics in 2000, I worked for 17 years in the financial and business world. And the longer I did so, the more intrigued I became by a frequent mismatch between the way economists model economies and the way markets often work in practice. Economists usually rely on equilibrium models to make predictions and assume that within certain information constraints, economic actors can optimize their trading possibilities on the basis of rational expectations. And yet the markets I saw around me were dynamic and creative processes, driven by relentless innovation and perpetual novelty, by self-reinforcing emotional spasms of euphoria and despair, and by the massive uncertainty that these imply. As Schumpeter famously said, creative destruction is the central fact about capitalist economies. And in this uncertain world, individuals seem to me to be driven as much by imagination and sentiment as by reason. When you think about it, entrepreneurs are forever inventing new goods, imagining new options, devising new strategies, and consumers are forever dreaming new dreams. And since we know so very little about the future that we and others are creating, we sometimes have to imagine how it will be. There are regularities in our behaviour, of course, but as often as not, these are a function of social norms and national or international regulation, rather than any predictable tendency to optimise among given factors. Now, all this can be problematic for standard economics, based as it is on what George Shackle famously called the metaphor of celestial mechanics. That is, based essentially on static equilibrium models and rationalist micro-foundations. Standard economics works very well, of course, in many areas where the parameters are fairly stable. But if you want also to make sense of the creative and social aspects of markets and the role of imagination and sentiment in behaviour, then I thought you needed a new approach. And the solution it increasingly seemed to me was for economics to supplement its standard models with new ones derived from, you've guessed it, the poetry and philosophy of the Romantics. Now, why the Romantics? Because they had always seen imagination and sentiment as central, and had analysed creativity and emotion in unsurpassed depth. And so in the book, The Romantic Economist, I argue that Romanticism is indeed a surprisingly fruitful source of new assumptions, models and metaphors for economists. Now, perhaps the most important general lesson of the Romantics concerns the role played by metaphors and models in structuring our beliefs, actions, and therefore social reality itself. The Romantics were clear that there is no one definitive and objective way of looking at the world, that you never have some unmediated perception of the facts out there. Your mind doesn't just passively record and reflect facts out there. Rather, if you're going to make sense of the chaos about you, you must supply an intellectual framework, a metaphorical colouring, a principle of selection. As Wordsworth put it, you half create the world you see. Your mind is a creator and receiver both. Any observation you make is the joint product of sense data that your mind receives and the particular conceptual structure that your mind contributes to make sense of that data. Or as the poet Coleridge put it, metaphors and theories can act like your lantern, showing you how to find and arrange the facts that are significant. You cannot do without models or metaphors to help you understand the world, any more than you can do without a lantern to see in the dark. But the trouble with lanterns, or with theories and metaphors for that matter, is that the light they cast, the focus they bring, is limited and partial. And this means that if you only use one metaphor, one theoretical framework, you'll keep stumbling on aspects of reality outside the area illuminated by your theory. To put it another way, the lens of metaphor or theory can bias and distort your vision as well as focus it. As Coleridge put it another way, no simile runs on all four legs. And this is what I think makes theoretical and metaphorical dogmatism so dangerous. It makes you like a horse wearing blinkers, or I gather you say blinders. Good at focusing straight ahead on one thing, but liable to miss the unexpected coming at you from left field. And this is why I think changing the metaphors we use, experimenting with different metaphors, different models, is so important, because it helps us make sense of different aspects of reality. It's also why I think it's important for economists to deconstruct the hidden metaphors they use to be more aware of the mechanical and equilibrium metaphors that litter their discourse. And notice it's not just economists and other social scientists who need to vary the metaphors they use. So do policymakers and entrepreneurs who use economics to structure their decisions and actions. The myopia of monovision, of using only one set of models, when extended to the applied use of economic ideas, leads to policy blind spots and the construction of a dangerously homogeneous social world or marketplace. Indeed, I would argue that monovision has been a major contributory factor behind the current crisis. Because before the crisis erupted, most central bankers, treasury officials and financiers around the world were so convinced that the Greenspan approach to monetary policy, the efficient market hypothesis, and neoclassical models were sufficient, and had so internalized this one perspective that they were simply not predisposed to see the problems that were emerging because their theoretical and conceptual framework had no place for them. The current crisis shows the epistemological weakness of economic dogma, of the belief that any one theoretical framework can be sufficient to deal with all eventualities. But analytical monocultures of this sort on the part of policymakers and bankers not only lead to blindness to the unexpected, they can also help construct a dangerous homogeneity of behaviour. For example, the Basel II validated regulatory monoculture of risk models and the almost uniform convergence by most investment banks on similar return on equity strategies and Gaussian distribution-inspired value-at-risk models led to extraordinarily high correlations across most financial markets worldwide, and to herding behaviour into the latest products where innovation rents were high. Now, as I shall discuss in a moment, the recent economic monoculture of the efficient market hypothesis and the banking monoculture of risk models resulted in more than blindness to the unexpected and very high correlations in behaviour. They were also profoundly misguided models for analysing innovative and emotional markets. And the solution to all three problems that I advocate in the book is to experiment with new metaphors, and in particular organic metaphors from Romanticism and the non-linear maths of complexity theory that was pioneered in Santa Fe. That is to switch away from the efficient market hypothesis inherent in the dominant social physics metaphor of economics, and instead look at the market as a dynamic process, more akin perhaps to an ecosystem, characterized by increasing returns and threshold effects. Coleridge once likened default risk to a fever at once contagious and epidemic. And this simile, merely suggestive in his day, because there were crashes in his day too, now finds echoes in the recommendations by Andrew Haldane of the Bank of England that we should learn from epidemiology how to model market panic. That you can take equations used for modelling flu or SARS pandemics and use them to model market panic. Organic metaphors applied to financial markets can also draw attention to the fact that a lack of modelling or epistemic diversity increases the danger of simultaneous infection by some unforeseen weakness. Just as in biology or agriculture, a lack of genetic diversity leaves a population or crop at risk of catastrophic failure if some new threat or disease materializes. Now, I'm not suggesting here that economists should reject the old mechanical and equilibrium models entirely or deny their analytical power. It is the standard models of economics and risk analysis that disclose such predictable order as there often is in the apparent chaos of markets. It is standard economics that has isolated the allocative genius of many markets and the power of price incentives. My aim is instead to underline why these standard models sometimes work so well and other times fail lamentably to disclose what is important. And my thesis is that both the standard equilibrium-based models with assumptions of rationally optimizing individuals and Gaussian risk models are much less successful than organic or biology-inspired models when you're modeling innovative markets, social interdependence, and Knightian uncertainty. And this leads me to argue, I think, that economists need to be much cleverer about establishing the boundaries of applicability of their standard models, because this will help bolster their effectiveness, and it will also allow them to be supplemented by new models better suited to studying outside these boundaries. Now let me turn to a second intellectual failure in economics that helps explain this crisis, I think, every bit as much as does the myopia and homogeneity of behaviour caused by relying on one economic paradigm and one set of risk models. Behind the current crisis lies, I believe, an intellectual failure to understand the impact of creativity and innovation on the prevalence of uncertainty. Uncertainty is an inevitable byproduct of innovation and the human capacity to imagine new options. A novel idea and innovation injects some entirely new elements into the equations of life. I mean, think, for example, of the invention of the internet. Its impact was almost entirely unpredictable ahead of its invention. It's a very obvious point, but one that is often forgotten by economists. There is often no way that you can define all the possible outcomes in advance of innovation or the creation of new products. And innovation often implies an important break in previously stable regularities of behaviour. Imagination and novelty, that is, create uncertainty and break the predictable links between the past and the future. Now, why this is so important and topical now is that the assumptions implicit in most models used by banks before the credit crunch was that this uncertainty about the future could be turned into measurable risk on the basis of correlations trawled from data in the past. All you needed was a clever enough model and relevant data. But regularities in past behaviour were very unlikely to be a safe predictor of future risks when bankers were themselves innovating furiously, bringing out complex new products each week that made it impossible for the future to resemble the old financial environment in which the data was gathered. So the moral that I draw is that in each sector you need to some extent to choose between innovation and predictability. And if you want a particular sector to be more predictable in risk terms, and I think most of us now would prefer the banking sector to be that, then you have to limit innovation there. Now, of course, in most sectors of the economy, you'd presumably prefer to have innovation to predictability, but the point is you can't really have both. Now, uncertainty is also a function, of course, of self-reinforcing reactions, including emotional reactions to small events, and to the crossing of hidden tipping points. This is more the uncertainty of Taleb's black swan or of complexity theory. But this other kind of uncertainty only, I think, underscores the need for a new set of economic and management assumptions about our relationship with the unknown future. So I argue that most economists and bankers have woefully underestimated the amount of Knightian uncertainty in an innovative economy. Worse still, this intellectual failure was compounded by the error of embracing what Michael Power has called the grand narrative of risk management. The idea that all uncertainty can be resolved into measurable risk with all the attendant illusion of control and spurious claims to optimality. This was a monoculture especially unsuited to the uncertain world of innovative and emotion-fueled markets. Similarly unsuitable, I think, within the discipline of economics is the monoculture of rational expectations and the efficient market hypothesis. How on earth are agents supposed to optimize their fitness or whatever under conditions that are constantly mutating, or where we do not have the wherewithal to form fully rational expectations? It's for these reasons that I think we need to supplement standard neoclassical economic models where they work well with others at the macro level, and in particular organic and complexity theory models that simulate how dynamic markets might behave under certain conditions. And using organic metaphors and non-linear maths to help us model creative and unpredictable markets does not, of course, allow you to predict exactly what will happen, but it does allow you to understand the sensitivity around certain tipping points and to spot likely emerging patterns, just as those trying to monitor flu pandemics can understand better what is going to happen by using their equations. As we know, they can't predict exactly what will happen, but they can understand the dynamics better. And if we understand markets as like an ecosystem, we can understand and model, though not predict, the impact of a new idea. A new idea is like a DNA mutation in an ecosystem. In the right circumstances, a small change in how we think can lead to very important but unpredictable and non-linear changes in the economy as a whole. At the micro level, I think it's important to remember that imagination is not only a cause of uncertainty, it's also our best tool for coping with uncertainty. As an individual agent, if you have no firm basis for forming rational expectations, then you must look to your imagination to provide you with working assumptions and a possible vision of the future, and apparently feasible strategies for enacting this vision if it's appealing. And in an uncertain world, I would argue that the successful are likely to be those who display what the poet John Keats called negative capability. That is, being willing to remain in uncertainties, mysteries and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Much better to remain alert and sceptical and imaginatively receptive to pointers as they emerge than to strain all the time to predict the unknowable future. So for this reason, I argue that we need to have a new set of micro-foundations in economics to stand alongside the existing ones of Homo economicus, economic man, and so on, including the figure I invent in the book, Homo romanticus, the person who's driven by her own imagination and emotions. That is, to move away from a sole reliance on one set of standard micro-foundations. I think it also points to the need for a rather different picture of the ideal policy wonk or management guru than often peddled in MBA courses. In particular, if you're going to successfully chart your way through the unknown future, you need not only to choose from a wide variety of existing models, but also sometimes to create new ones. And here what David Stark of Columbia calls the productive dissonance, or generative friction, of using side-by-side different models and metaphors is vital. It is in the imaginative connections between different theoretical frameworks and models that our creative potential resides. It is in these new connections that our capacity to invent new lanterns to see in the dark is located. Negative capability, being open to new connections, and the active experimentation with new metaphors and models are both key attributes of economist and of economic agent alike. Now, it seems hard to believe now, but another crucial element missing from most economic models and risk models before the crisis was any attempt to factor in the importance of dangerous and useful sentiments and emotions. Only now, when the evidence of irrational exuberance, followed by blind panic, is inescapable, and the impact of both is seen to have been huge, are we seeing serious economists like George Akerlof and Robert Schiller rediscovering Adam Smith's moral sentiments or John Maynard Keynes's animal spirits. Only now are economists rediscovering that animal spirits threaten the ability of markets to be efficient and of expectations to be rational. Only now are they rediscovering that without moral sentiments, we have little chance of either taming these animal spirits or coping successfully with uncertainty. And here also I think economists have much to learn from the romantics like Coleridge and the late English romantic John Ruskin. It is the poet Coleridge who provides, I think, one of the best descriptions of boom and bust I've ever seen in one of his lay sermons, where he talks about boom and bust happening when rational circumspection gives way to emulous ambition in caution and a vortex of hopes and hazards, of blinding passions and blind practices. And the most interesting aspect of Coleridge's thought here was that he thought this happened whenever the lust of lucre, as he put it, was not sufficiently balanced by the correctives of religion. On this view, economic rationality is not some inalienable right of economic man, but a fragile product of a necessary balance between a desire for money on the one hand and moral restraint on the other. Now, this obviously represents a huge challenge not only to society, but to the micro-level assumptions of the economics profession. If rationality, the settled disposition to take account of all factors, is only evident when avaricious sentiments are balanced by moral sentiments. It was John Ruskin who first, I think, articulated how important the nobler sentiments of trust, loyalty and team spirit are for good company performance. As economists might put it now, they're valuable because they reduce opportunism and solve coordination problems. It's trust and loyalty that will allow workers willingly to suspend their own short-term self-interest. And as such, trust and loyalty are much cheaper and more effective, incidentally, for companies than all the paraphernalia of a non-trust company, like the spying on emails, the clocking in and out, the performance targets, and so on. Now, a good example of a sophisticated attempt to build these sort of considerations of moral sentiments into economic models is George Akerlof's efficiency wage hypothesis. Akerlof analyzes the labour market on an analogy of gift exchange. The idea that loyalty on the part of managers breeds loyalty on the part of their staff, that a fair wage leads to more work. As a result, he argues that if companies renege on agreements and cut staff or wages in response to short-term difficulties, they're in danger of sacrificing the long-term loyalty of their staff that is important to their long-term performance. And they need to be very sure that these short-term gains outweigh the long-term costs of a long-term loss of loyalty. And he uses this idea to help explain why it is that you don't get wages cut in a recession to the market clearing rate, why you get persistent unemployment. Because the good companies know that it's not in their own interests to cut wages to as low as they could get away with in a recession, because their staff will become demotivated and work less well after the recession. Now, the question for economics is how best to integrate these facets into the discipline. Should economics just bolt on such insights from behavioural studies where they find systematic regularities and so modify standard models? And I think this is the preferred route of Akerlof and Schiller, indeed. Or should these deeper insights into the complexity of human motivation be used to help establish new boundaries of applicability for standard economic models, so that we understand where standard models need to be supplemented with insights from related disciplines like psychology and applied ethics? I notice these two routes are very different. The first is the continued attempt to perfect and amend the one standard paradigm. The other, the one I favour, is that you admit that you always need more than one set of models, that you need different models to deal with different aspects of economic reality. Now let me finish by outlining some romantic pointers to good policy practice. In particular, I would recommend the virtues here of Keats's negative capability, of policymakers being open to new ideas and not rushing to impose one favoured interpretation on facts as they see them. Policymakers cannot operate without theories, without lanterns to see in the dark, but they can remain open-minded about which ones to rely on. They can remain open-mindedly receptive to alternative perspectives and to inconvenient pointers as they show up. What is really essential, I think, is that the government system ensures that the policy advice that politicians receive is not structured solely in line with the dominant theory of the day or the dominant party ideology. The central point here is that there is never only one right way of looking at the world, and this goes as well for the current darlings Keynes and Minsky as it goes for those of Greenspan and Friedman a few short years ago. A related general point is that I think that we should avoid an economic monoculture, the global internalization of a monistic worldview like that implied by the Washington Consensus, the World Trade Organization rules, or even perhaps the EU's Lisbon Agenda. Because such a monoculture implies us all having the same blind spots, the same policy weaknesses. And it implies the danger of simultaneous infection by some unforeseen weakness, as well as highly correlated downturns. As a result, I think we need to be more wary than we have been up to now about the discourse of universal best practice. We need to avoid global benchmarking to the best standard, because there is no one best standard. And in trade and finance, we should perhaps downplay the emphasis on a level playing field and global harmonization of regulations, and instead stress the importance of a modus vivendi between different regulatory regimes. Danny Roderick at Harvard has made the very interesting point that maybe one of the reasons that world trade was less volatile in the GATT era than in the modern world trade era is that that was a way of integrating very different regulatory regimes, whereas the World Trade Organization tries to harmonize trade regulations across different countries. And a final general policy point is that the radical uncertainty caused by innovation or by self-reinforcing emotional reactions not only causes problems for entrepreneurs and bankers, depriving them of their ability to act on fully rational calculations or rely legitimately on quantitative risk models. Uncertainty also imposes limits on the foresight of government and on the value of government intervention. For example, given how much is new in the current climate, how can my central bank, the Bank of England, have enough faith in its models and its central forecast that it is willing to bet more than 300 billion sterling on its quantitative easing programme? The answer, I fear, is that that is what their best model tells them to do. And yet, if we take uncertainty and emotional responses seriously, as the Romantic approach suggests that we should, then it implies the limits on the capacity of government models, as well as the likelihood of market failure. It suggests that government agencies should be more careful to commit to strong action before they have consulted the often conflicting signals given by a wide array of different models. In short, I think it suggests that we should beware governments bearing 5-year plans and central forecasts quite as much as economists peddling the efficient market hypothesis. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Please wait for the wireless mic to come. If you want to raise your hand and then just tell us your name and also what you're studying before you ask your question. Please.
My name is Christian Smith. I'm an international relations major. I guess I was wondering, as students, when we're taught these models, we're kind of focusing on them in our education. What can we do as students to kind of develop this negative capability you're talking about and kind of prepare for this world you're describing?
Yes, that is actually something I talk about a lot, and we'll be discussing, if any of you are coming to an economics lecture a bit later on today, is how to apply this to research as opposed to policy. As I said when I said I thought you need a lantern, you need a theory, you need models. I'm not in any sense saying that you should try and do research without models. You have to use a model, and at some point you have to specialise in one, or you'll go crazy and you won't have a viable research project. I think there are certain points, though, in a research project where you can be more sensitive, exhibit, if you like, analytical negative capability. And that to alternative perspectives, more sensitive to alternative perspectives. And that would include, for example, when you define the nature of your research question. I mean, we would all agree that the theory you use should to some extent be driven by the nature of the research problem rather than the other way around. But that ideally should then involve that you don't have theoretical bias in the initial reading of how you set up the problem, because then it's hard to be sure which theory would be the right one. So I think what I would argue is that at certain key stages of research, in particular the initial problem definition phase, one reads you are careful to read very carefully around, use different perspectives, different models, see, well, look, if we were to use, or if people in another discipline were looking at this, what would they say the problem? Would they even think there was a problem? I mean, sometimes we think there's a problem in our own discipline, and other disciplines already think they've solved it. Well, you need to know that, before you start. So looking at a sort of multi-paradigm look at the initial research problem is one phase. I think the other thing is at the end of research, when you've ensured that your choice of theory was driven by the nature of the problem and you've then concentrated on one theory, as you have to do, one important other discipline is to ensure that you translate your assumptions and findings back into what Wordsworth called the language really used by men, back into English or Spanish or whatever it happens to be, out of maths, in other words, so that those in other disciplines can audit your work. This is particularly important for professional academics. Very often, I think, if sociologists understood the assumptions economists were making, they would have shot them down in the senior common room long ago. But they don't understand it because it's in maths. So I think it's essential to translate the assumptions and findings of models back into English to open them to audit to those from other perspectives. I mean, there are limits to how many perspectives we can each internalise, but if you make it open to those in other disciplines to audit your research, that is something you can do. And a very important early founding member of economics called Alfred Marshall always argued for this, that mathematics should never, he said, be the engine of inquiry. It should be more like a diagnostic tool.
My name is Eric Darcy. I graduated in anthropology. I'm curious, I'm sure you understand, and we all grasp the appeal of these models that are very tidy and explain the variables. Maybe you could share some experiences you've had in having conversations and dialogues with policymakers that tend to latch on to that fact-based and evidence-based approach, and then kind of some avenues that you see for making that conversation and that multiple model inclusion possible.
Well, I'll just share with you a couple of little anecdotes. I remember many years ago having a discussion with someone on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England when they were first had independent monetary policy. And there was some discussion at the time, but not enough, as it turns out, about what their target should be. And of course they chose the consumer price index, the retail price inflation. And I asked this guy, and I wasn't alone, there were other people making the same point, shouldn't you also be targeting asset prices? And it's not because I foresaw the crisis, I'm afraid, I didn't. But it was very well known in the UK that house prices are a serious issue in terms of causing dislocation between regions and so on and so forth. We've always had a problem with overinflated house prices. So it struck me that at least at a social and economic level, this was an important target as well. And I got this withering look from this very good economist, a good friend of mine. He said, don't be ridiculous, you can't have two targets at once. And I thought, but in the rest of life we have a number of targets, and we have to work out how to balance them. And I think that would be indeed is one of my messages to policymakers when I give talks to them, is that I think we need to be a bit more explicit about how there are different goals out there, and that we need it all. It's a political choice, it's a value choice often, how we weight these different targets. And it's no good just taking one of them and saying that's the only one that we care about. The same is true with models from the sort of epistemological point of view. I think what you've tended to see in central banks and in treasuries around the world is a tendency to reinvent what the best model is every 10 years. And they tend to bear little relationship to each other. I mean, as an ex-civil servant, my wife tells a story about looking back in the files in the treasury to see why it was that they shifted to Friedmanite monetary policy from the previous one. There was absolutely no analysis of the shift. It just shifted, really, basically, at one point, because it had become clear the old paradigm wasn't working. And my point really is it would be much better to run in parallel the different paradigms. You might believe that one is tending to show you what's most important at the moment. That's fair enough. But still run them all in parallel. And if one suddenly flashes red warning lights at you and says, look, have you noticed what's going on here? Then you take that into account. So that, I think, is on the policy side, is to be is not to be so wedded to the best model, and best practice is a term that's got into almost all management speak, policy speak, even academic speak, and I think it's a dangerous phenomenon.
My name is Ryan Fairchild. I'm studying Spanish translation and economics. I found the idea of a more heterogeneous system both appealing and reasonable. And I was wondering, because it seems that one of the reasons we seek sort of this universal best practice system is for more efficiency, especially WTO trade rules.
Absolutely.
In having a more heterogeneous system, how would you suggest that we maintain efficiency while also preventing these sort of shocks that can happen if you have all the same things?
That's a very good question, and essentially there is an important trade-off between static efficiency, if you like, and dynamic efficiency, if you want to put it in those terms. It's one that, incidentally, Joseph Schumpeter outlined way back in the 40s, that what is efficient at one particular point in time, in allocative efficiency terms, may not be the same as what is efficient in terms of how you dynamically change and innovate over time. So you need to be aware of that tension I think in lots of areas of economics, that what is efficient in allocation terms may not be the same as what preserves your innovative potential or whatever. And the same is true, I think, in this question of fire breaks between different markets. It is, of course, the case that if you make a market very homogeneous, all according to the same rules, it will tend to you'll get more trade, you will get more efficient allocation. But if the flip side of that is that this whole system is much more susceptible to a downturn if those regulations are misconceived and there's something that the regulators didn't understand that causes a problem with that regulatory system, then that is a problem. So I mean, it's again a trade-off between compossibility, if you like, and efficiency. And I think it's just a matter of being more aware of them. I wouldn't deny that there is a trade-off. There is. But it's just a matter of being aware of that. And I think the European Union has been struggling with this throughout its history, of how much do you allow for some differentiation and how much do you harmonise. And there's no one right answer to it. I think you've got to work out in each particular case what the trade-off should be.
Hi, I'm Scott Bradford. I'm in the economics department.
Many of my best friends are in economics department.
Yes. So I realize a lot of what you said may have just been rhetorical flourish. But I just want to try to react a bit and as part of a constructive dialogue. I think it is pretty clear that some models are better than others. Heaven help a nation that embraces a bad economic model, such as Soviet Russia or North Korea or the African kleptocracies. And I would say the economists do not reject Schumpeter or reject dynamic models. And in fact, there is not, again, from my point of view, there's not a monoculture of economic models. You speak about the one theoretical framework of economics. I'm not sure what that is, because there are lots of dynamic models out there trying to analyze international trade in a dynamic way, immigration, financial markets. All the models I know that are recognized are dynamic models, not a static model. All kinds of economic models do account for increasing returns to scale, account for threshold effects, and so I think there's a lot more variety in terms of economic approach than may have been implied by your remarks. Now, one thing where I think there probably is agreement here, and there are others as well, I'm sure, is being very skeptical about what governments can do because of the uncertainty that you mentioned, because of possibly dangerous monoculture, maybe in the policy world, even if there is or is not monoculture among economists in the models that they use. So, you know, well, I guess what we need is kind of a more detailed discussion of what caused the crisis, and then who foresaw it. That would give credibility to what people say if people actually foresaw it, and then respond, you know, kind of move on from there. You mentioned the housing market, so you know, different points of view here, and different economists have different points of view on this. Many economists blame the federal government, to some degree at least, for pumping up the housing market, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and making mortgages too easy to obtain in terms of subsidizing the mortgage market through government policy. On the other hand, greed among bankers and even among the buyers is certainly relevant as well. So I think you know, there's probably more diversity than what may be implied by your remarks. I think, though, it is important to examine these models more carefully and to not, in the banking finance world, I think there's just a need to accept a model and run with it. Among academic economists, I think there's a lot more skepticism about models than may occur in the financial world. But again, very interesting, and I think there's a lot more to discuss here.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd entirely agree with that. And one of the points I made very early on in the book is that to the extent that I think these are a set of romantic critiques that I use in the book, that's only because I noticed that there were a set of critiques out there, all of them developed by economists within the economics profession, about the role of incommensurable values, the importance of dynamic efficiency as well as static efficiency, and so on, the limitations of rational expectations models. And it suddenly occurred to me that all of these were linked historically by being part of the romantic critique of a very narrow form of rationalism. So I absolutely accept that within the economics profession there is a lot of, there is not a monoculture. With one exception to that, which I'll come on to. So I agree to a large extent this is about the application of it. And it is indeed the case that central banks were using models almost to every one of them that didn't include the financial system. Now that is a strange thing to do for a central bank. So I think there is a problem here with using one set of models in the applied use of economics, which is different, of course, from academic economics. And also in the financial world, the risk models were, I think, much too driven by one definition of risk and not taking account of uncertainty. I said one exception in the academic area. I think there is one exception, and it's the monoculture at the micro-foundational level. At the micro-foundational level, there is, across most economists, not all, an insistence that ultimately you want to preserve the neoclassical micro-foundations, the rational optimizing individual, and that if you aren't doing that, in some senses it isn't economics. It stops being economics and becomes sociology or whatever. And sometimes I think this leads to what I termed the sort of bolt-on effect, so that a very clever economist like George Akerlof, for example, the efficiency wage hypothesis that I mentioned, you take a behavioral regularity that is noticeable and noted, and you build it bolt it on to the standard models as a patch, if you like, an empirical patch to make the models work better. All the work on framing by Kahneman and Tversky and so on, similarly, these are very, very acute and hugely useful models, but they're usually used by the economics profession as a sort of patch to make the system work better. This reminds me of Kuhn's point about late Ptolemaic astronomy, it becoming more and more complex in order to preserve the central Earth at the centre dynamic, if you like. And I would argue not for a paradigm shift, I'm not arguing for a paradigm shift, but for running several paradigms side by side to be confident in how useful and brilliant the standard economic model is, and stop trying to post hoc mend it all the time, and to use alternative models is what I'm basically arguing for. Because I think the other problem you get to if you do this patches is a kind of incoherence within the models. And an example of this I think would be endogenous growth theory, which exactly builds in the Schumpeterian creative destruction, the non-linear returns to innovation and so on, but it still assumes the rational optimizing individual investor who is rationally probabilistically forecasting the impact of his innovative R&D and so on. And at some level, I would question whether those micro-foundations really fit with the non-linearity of innovation and so on. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm actually in sort of what you call heterodox circles. I tend to be told off for saying standard economics is 80% right. I'm not quite sure of the figure, but I'm a huge fan of standard economics. It's just I wish that the boundaries of applicability of the standard models was a little clearer so that we understood where they let us down. And I think it's where Knightian uncertainty is very important, is a major example of that. Does that help?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.